Welcome to our program today. The topic is the Yukon in World War I. I'm your host, Max Fraser, and with me, our guest is Michael Gates, Yukon historian and author. Welcome, Michael.
Welcome, Max.
Michael has a regular weekly column, History Hunters, in the Yukon News, and has authored Gold at 40 Mile Creek. And help me out, Michael, the book about Jack Dalton?
Dalton's Gold Rush Trail.
So today we're talking about the Yukon in World War I. Michael, maybe I can ask you to help us understand what it was like in the Yukon on August 4th, 1914, when war broke out.
Well, the glory days were gone for Dawson City. The gold rush was now 16 years in the past, and the population of Dawson had declined dramatically from the peak of 15 to 18,000 people. There may have been 2,500 people in the gold rush capital at that time. So it wasn't the same community that it once was. The wide open atmosphere, the gambling and the dance halls, all of those things had been banished as civilization encroached. And saloons were soon to be going in the same direction.
Was Dawson still considered the Paris of the North? It had telegraph and telephones and newspapers. It was one of the more advanced cities in Western Canada, was it not? It was,
and it was an unusual place because being so isolated and so remote, and even though the peak of the gold rush had long since passed, it still retained many of the elements, the facets, and the aura as well. A lot of the miners had moved on. They'd been displaced by large corporate operations, two in particular, the Canadian Klondike Mining Company operated by Joe Boyle, and the Yukon Gold Company, which was operated by the Guggenheims.
So it's August 4th. The papers in Dawson had been running a lot of international news about the goings-on in Europe, and I believe by August 4th, some countries in Europe had declared war on one another, and there was a question about whether England, and with it Canada, would be involved in the outbreak of war. Can you tell us how things went down in Dawson that day?
Well, from the perspective of someone who was there at the time, Laura Burton, she said that it rather caught them by surprise, that it was in the news, but there was a revolution in Spain, and there were things happening in Ireland, and it was just another one of those topics in the news. Although 3 days before August 4th, the Dawson News had large headlines filling the top third of the paper that said war. And at that point, it wasn't yet Britain declaring war, but it was a rather ominous foreshadowing of what was to come.
So on August 4th, as I understand it, there were 3 theaters operating that evening. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened that night?
Yes, well, the 3 theaters in question were the Orpheum, the Auditorium Theater, which we know today as the Palace Grand, and the Dawson Amateur Athletic Association building, or the D3A. And at the largest of these, which was the Palace Grand Theater, the Blacks, George Black, the commissioner, and his wife were entertaining a group in one of the boxes and taking in the film, or the films that were offered that night. And at some point during the evening, someone approached him with a telegram, and when he read it, he rose ominously and proceeded to the front of the theater and made the grave announcement that Britain had declared war. And of course, everybody was dumbstruck by that. They knew what it meant. If Britain was at war, then Canada was at war as well, because at that time Canada wasn't its own nation.
So how did the crowd react to this news?
Well, there were some Mounties in the audience, and en masse they rose and started singing God Save the King, and pretty soon the entire theater was up shaking the rafters with their patriotic songs. And the same happened at the Dawson Amateur Athletic Association. And as soon as the crowd dispersed from the theaters, the streets were abuzz with this news.
So in the ensuing days, was there a Klondike stampede to enlist, so to speak? There were recruiting drives launched right away, I believe?
Yes, that's correct. Commissioner Black started advertising immediately in the newspapers for volunteers. Once he received official notification, which was the 6th of August, the following day you can see advertisements in the paper asking for volunteers. And this type of campaigning continued throughout the war. And many rose to the call, and they rose very quickly. And some men started out immediately to enlist in places like Vancouver, Victoria, Toronto, Montreal. Some even returned to their motherland, England, where they enlisted. And there was one individual who didn't have the money for a boat fare, and he went around and tried to solicit some support so he could go out and enlist, and he was turned down. So he stuffed some hardtack into his pack, and he walked the 325 miles from Dawson City to Whitehorse so that he could proceed to enlist. And the irony of that was when he arrived in Victoria, he was rejected for having flat feet.
That's a long way to go to enlist, only to be turned down. Now, there's a great story about Klondike Joe Boyle, who was one of Dawson's leading citizens at the time, and his efforts around a machine gun detachment. Can you tell us about Joe Boyle and his machine gun detachment?
Well, he wasn't the most popular guy at the time. He'd had some problems with the utility company which he had managed, but he immediately stepped forward and in a patriotic fashion, contacted the Minister of Militia, Sam Hughes, and offered to raise a company of 50 men to operate a machine gun company for the armed forces. And on September 2nd, barely a month since the declaration of war, he received a telegram from Hughes accepting his offer. And very quickly they raised a body of men, not quite 50 men. They were joined with some Yukoners when they arrived in Victoria, but they very quickly enlisted a substantial number of men, 38 I believe, and there was a lot of patriotic fervor. They were given a dog which became their mascot. One of the local musicians changed the lyrics to "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" to add a Yukon flavor. The ladies of the community rustled up some items that they could give to the soldiers who were heading off, and they had a very large reception where they congratulated these men and cheered them on for their heroic offer.
I think they went out on a boat in October or something like that. I think I read October 10th. They left Dawson and headed south.
That's about right. And they went to Vancouver and were very quickly expedited to Britain. But it was more than a year before they actually were sent forward into combat.
Now, turning forward to 1916, I believe Commissioner Black raised a company of men, like a second unit out of Dawson. Can you talk about what George Black was doing?
Well, George Black was very patriotic. He was a United Empire loyalist. He was a true champion of the Crown, and he was chomping at the bit to be one of the people to step forward and offer his services. And in the fall of 1915, he negotiated arrangements with the government, because he was an employee of the government as the commissioner. He was the top bureaucrat in the Yukon. And he arranged to go overseas and at the same time raise a company of volunteers to join him. And by the time he left the Yukon, 225 other men had joined him. They were Canadians, they were British, they were Scottish. There were some Americans who could see the shadow of war looming in the American horizon. There were Serbs and Croats who were affected by the involvement in the Balkans. All of these men very quickly offered themselves up. And over the course of the summer, they departed the Yukon. The first group was about 125 or 130 men, and then a smaller group of 35 men, and then George Black with about 120. All of them proceeded to Victoria, where they were established in exhibition grounds, which have been converted for training camp. It's called the Willows. And there the men did the basic training that all men in the military do in preparation for their departing for overseas.
So fast forward a year or so, George Black's company is in England. Joe Boyle's machine gun detachment is in England, although Joe Boyle is not attached to his detachment. His story is rather separate. But can you talk about when Yukon troops first went to France and what kind of action and battles they were involved with there?
Well, of all the Yukoners, the men of the Boyle unit were the ones who saw the most action, and in some ways were the most heroic. From the onset, they were involved in many of the major battles of World War I. Courcelette, Vimy, Passchendaele, the spring German offensive of 1918, the Battle of Amiens, and the 100 Days offensive, Canal du Nord. All of these battles had the Yukoners of the Boyle Company engaged. And by the end of the war, all of the officers from the Boyle Company had been awarded decorations for their valor in the field, as well as 13 of the men who volunteered the other ranks. So that was a very high percentage for a unit of that sort.
So they were a machine gun unit. Were they involved in trench warfare, or were they more mobile? How did that work?
Well, as you know, most of the battles that I've outlined up until Amiens were trench battles. But they were involved in the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and there was a lot of trench warfare there before they actually participated in the major offensive. And George Black's company of soldiers, when did they first see action on the battlefields of Europe? Well, they arrived in Britain in February of 1917, and there they remained at Whitley Camp, training some more and training yet more, getting lectures on every subject related to military activity, taking machine guns apart and putting them together, learning how to put bullets into the belts that were used to feed the machine guns, everything they could possibly know, until one of the men said that they knew how to do it blindfolded. But they still didn't see action. They trained some more, and some men bridled at this. Some actually asked for transfers so that they could see action more quickly. And they were very subjected to rigorous medical examination. You had to be very strong and very agile to operate in a machine gun company. So a few of them were selected and transferred because they didn't pass muster. So it was March of 1918 when they finally were sent over to France. Just at the beginning of this major German offensive. And although they weren't sent to the front for that, they were primed and ready on August 8th when the major offensive at Amiens took place.
And how did they do in that first big battle?
Well, the Canadians were considered the elite troops, the shock troops, in World War I. And the Battle of Amiens was described by senior command in the German army as a black day of the war, because they gained 16 miles, which would have been 25 kilometers, in one offensive, and that was the end of the trench warfare. It was open terrain, and it was a whole new sort of battle. And the officer in command of the Boyle unit at one time referred to them as the Yukon Army, because they had a reputation of being able to perform above and beyond the expectations of a small machine gun company.
That's fascinating. And as far as I understand, the Yukon units and people serving in the war from the Yukon actually distinguished themselves in combat, like disproportionately compared to the rest of the Canadian Army, for example. Are there some stories you can tell us about individuals who distinguished themselves?
Yes. One good example was a man who most would have thought was over the hill. His name was James Murdoch Christie. And Christie was a miner and an outdoorsman who, in 1909, almost met his demise when he was trapping in the upper headwaters of the Stewart River with a partner. And he went out to track a grizzly bear that had invaded one of their caches. Now this was at the end of October. The bears should have been in hibernation by that time, so this was not good news. And he finally encountered the bear. The bear had the upper hand and charged him. He managed to get off a couple of rounds before the bear was on him, and it immediately crushed his skull in its jaws. He was severely injured. He put his hand in the bear's jaws to try and fend it off, and it broke his arm. Finally, the bullets, which had found their mark, affected the bear, and it collapsed and died. Had it not been for that, he wouldn't have survived.
Was he alone?
At that point he was, and he had to stagger 7 miles back to his cabin.
My goodness.
And get the fire going and wait for his partner to return. And after a couple of days of agonized resting, they strapped him to a sled, and for 5 days they mushed until they reached the Lansing trading post on the Stewart River. And there the trader and his wife took care of him for 2 months.
Wow.
Finally, he was able to mush back to Dawson City, but he was in need of major medical attention, so he was sent out to Victoria, and after a number of operations, his jaw was reconnected to his face so that he could eat once more.
My goodness. So how did he do on the battlefields of France in World War I?
Well, he did extremely well. He survived a bear attack, and I'm sure that after that, and combining that with his outdoors experience, he was fearless. He was almost 40 years old when he enlisted, almost too old to enter the field of combat. And despite that, he started with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and because of his specialized skills, he became a sniper. And he was engaged in a number of encounters in no man's land that elevated him both in reputation and in rank through field promotions from a mere private until he was an officer, field promoted to lieutenant in charge of their sniper unit. On one occasion, he and 4 others laid in wait for a German patrol that was they were well outnumbered. And when the Germans approached, they stood up and demanded that they give themselves up. Well, of course, the Germans took to ground and started firing back, but they inflicted considerable damage on this group before the Germans withdrew. And the Canadians, Christie and his men, returned safely to the Canadian lines without losing a man. And for one of his engagements, he was given the Distinguished Conduct Medal. That happened early in the war. And later, in another engagement, he again was in the no man's land. He had told his superior officers that he had seen evidence that the Germans had patrolled through no man's land the night before, and he had reason to believe that they would try it again. So they went out to ambush them. And this time they wreaked considerable damage, and they wiped out the entire German patrol. They were able to take their shoulder patches and all the letters and other paper material that the officers had. They brought that back to their lines for Canadian intelligence to analyze. And when he returned, there was a very senior officer there who was observing this encounter. He turned to this officer and he said, two of my men dropped their rifles and grabbed German rifles, and they've left our weapons in the field. I'd like to go back and get them. In fact, he practically insisted. So he went back out into no man's land to retrieve those weapons, and this greatly impressed the senior command. And for that, he was awarded the Military Cross.
Wow.
He was twice wounded in battle. And he was relieved of command in June of 1918.
Mm. So there's other Yukoners who distinguished themselves as well?
That's correct. There was a man named Roland Burke. His father was a doctor in Dawson. He was a student. And he was unable to enlist in Canada because he had bad eyesight. So the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force all turned him down. So he took a passage to England, and there he was accepted into the Royal Navy Reserve.
So they weren't so fussy about eyesight in the Navy, apparently.
Well, they didn't give him a big ship. They gave him a little boat. But he was a little man in a little boat, a little man in stature at least. But when they were trying to blockade the Belgian coast, one particular location where there was a submarine base, in a period of less than 3 weeks, he received both the Distinguished Service Order and the Victoria Cross for two sorties into the harbor to recover men who were abandoning sinking ships.
Right.
In the second one, they were about to leave and they heard 3 men calling for help. And while they retrieved them from the water, they were under heavy fire. And by the time they got to safety, the boat had been penetrated by 55 rounds of heavy armament, German armament, and 2 of his men had been killed.
My goodness.
Yes.
Well, the Yukon, as I understand it, enlisted about 600 individuals.
That's correct.
Can you talk about the losses overall for the Yukon?
Well, the Yukon, I'm compiling a name list, and there seem to be more than 600 names, although some of them are identified as Yukoners, although they may not necessarily have enlisted from the Yukon. There are still people that were considered Yukoners, 600 men. And of those, around 100 were killed in combat. We don't know how many were seriously injured, but we do know that of those 600, only 100 returned to the Yukon after the war was over.
Right. So Commissioner Black was wounded in the field, and while he was active in England and in France, his wife Martha was quite active in her own right. Can you talk very briefly about what Martha Black's occupation was in England and what support was from the home front in the Yukon for our troops overseas?
Yes, well, let's start with the second question first. From the outset of the war, there was tremendous support from the community. They had a Belgian relief fund. They had they were raising funds for a hospital ship. They were raising funds for the it was called the Yukon Relief Comfort Fund, and that was to provide aid and support to Yukoners who were overseas in battle or supporting their families. And Martha was unusual because she accompanied her husband to Victoria along with the other volunteers, and she accompanied him across the country to Halifax with a stop in Ottawa, where she insisted to the senior command that she be allowed to accompany him to England.
Which just wasn't done in those days. It wasn't proper for a lady to be on a troop full of, or a ship full of troops, sort of thing.
Well, she responded to that remark by pointing out that she'd joined the Klondike Gold Rush many years before, and there were 25 or 30,000 men, and it didn't trouble her then. She didn't see why 2,500 troops on a ship should be a problem. In the end, they caved in. And
well, good for Martha.
She served with the Red Cross, and she spent a lot of time supporting the men overseas. The wounded, she would visit them and provide them with the small things that a shaving kit or tobacco, things that they might need that would make their life a little bit more pleasant.
I think overall for the Yukon, we had a much greater contribution from the Yukon and its people and business community and various organizations, the IODE, et cetera, disproportionately high compared to the rest of Canada. Is that what your research has shown?
Well, my research has shown that Yukoners were very proud of their efforts in raising funds. I haven't compared their assertions with the facts, but they were aware that the rest of Canada was raising about $1 per person. And at the same time, Yukoners had been able to raise $20 per person.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, well, in the first 3 months, they'd raised over $20,000. In the first 2 years, they raised $65,000, and in 3 years, they had raised $95,000.
Well, we sure have a fascinating history of Yukon's involvement in World War I. And with any luck, we'll get to do this again sometime, Michael. Our time is at an end. Do you have any brief final words?
Well, just the sense that Yukoners have always been proud of who they are. And it speaks well to the fact that they were allowed to remain together in these two companies when they served overseas. And I'm sure that it led to high morale, and it also contributed to their valor in the field of combat.
Thank you, Michael Gates, for being such an informative guest on our show today. I'm Max Fraser. This has been the Yukon's involvement in World War I for Cable 9. Thank you.